In a recent video, we looked at why I believe that Muhammad existed, even though some in the West insist he is a later fabrication created to provide the Arab Empire with a hagiographical founding story. I essentially offered three arguments. One, there are very early non-Muslim references to Muhammad, the oldest of which is only 2 years after his death. By way of comparison, the earliest non-Christian reference to Jesus Christ is about 60 years after his crucifixion. Two, if no Muhammad existed, then no descendants of Muhammad existed either. So how can we understand the Shia, who have been fighting and warring against the Sunnis since the 7th century, on the claim that only Muhammad's descendants can lead the Muslim world as caliphs? Three, although the hadith was written down between 120 to 250 years following Muhammad's death, hence why those who claim Muhammad never existed dismiss them as unreliable, they do not behave the way one would expect forgeries to behave, namely by presenting Muhammad in glowing terms. Rather, they show him with all his warts, to the point that countless Muslims over the centuries have left Islam primarily because of the way Muhammad is depicted in the hadith. So what kind of forgeries meant to help Islam's founding story are these? So much for why I believe a Muhammad figure existed. Now let's turn to and evaluate the counter-arguments against his existence. There's only one problem. I don't know any of them, nor do I care to know any of them, nor do I need to know any of them to dismiss them. Why, you may ask? Because I do know one thing. Without hearing any of them, I already know none of them can, by their very nature, be conclusive. None of them can be incontrovertible, incontestable, or irrefutable. And this is really the grand point I'd like to make here. There is nothing in pre-modern history, certainly when it comes to people and events that are 14 centuries old, such as Muhammad and Islam, that can be proven or disproven. It's simply impossible. Sure, one can make arguments, but arguments are not incontrovertible proof. And short of that, short of concrete, irrefutable proof, people will always believe whatever is most emotionally satisfying to them or fits their needs. To be clear, I'm not saying that the arguments against Muhammad's existence are wrong. For all I know, they may be right. Maybe Muhammad never existed. Rather, what I am saying is that they cannot be proven one way or another on a scientific level, as pure objective facts that must be acknowledged by those who would count themselves among rational human beings. There will always be room for another interpretation, for a counterclaim. Why? Because it's history, literally, and we can't go back in time to prove what really did and did not happen. Let's, for example, look at what appears to be one of the main arguments against Muhammad's existence. And I know this because many of those people telling me to consult the works of Dr. J. Smith mention it. If I rightly understood it, it's the claim that there are no early records or archaeological evidence for Mecca, even though Mecca is obviously pivotal for Muhammad's existence. No Mecca, no Muhammad. My first reaction to this is the famous dictum, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we don't possess the evidence for something does not mean it never existed. What if Mecca was once on dozens of ancient maps, all of which are now, like most of history, lost? Is there proof that that cannot be the case? No, by nature there is no such proof. The opposite argument is also true. There are probably many civilizations and important people that we've never even heard of. Can you, for example, imagine how different our understanding of the past would be? How utterly bizarre history might seem if the Great Library of Alexandria and its world-changing contents weren't torched? At any rate, the argument against Mecca's existence kind of reminds me of the ancient city of Troy, from Homer's epic, the Iliad, with Achilles, Hector, Helen, etc. For centuries, all serious scholars and archaeologists maintained that Troy was purely mythological, that it never existed except as a make-believe stage for Homer's Iliad. Then, in the late 1800s, nearly 3,000 years after the recorded sacking of Troy, an amateur archaeologist, Heinrich Schliemann, found it in modern-day Turkey. This is a perfect example of how absence of evidence was never evidence of absence. But just to show you how nebulous the discipline of history truly is, when I first heard about Schliemann's discovery of Troy in a classics course I took back in the 90s, all I remember thinking about then is, how do we know what he found was Troy? How do we know it wasn't another perhaps wholly unknown or forgotten civilization? Such is the messiness of history. All this leads to my other main point, why the Muhammad never existed claim is a very weak, if not futile, polemic against Islam. It comes down to this, because very little can be unequivocally proven or disproven in history, guess what? People, in this case Muslims, will always embrace, and justifiably so, the version that best suits their needs, in this case that Muhammad existed. It's really as simple as that. Want proof? Guess who else even more scholars have for approximately 2 centuries, not just a few decades, been issuing academic book after academic book to prove that he never existed? Jesus Christ. Has the Christian world been rocked? Has Christianity died out? Have you ever heard of a single person who went from being a practicing observant Christian to apostatizing simply and only because they were convinced by academic arguments that Christ never existed? Yeah, me neither. By the way, and interestingly enough, my contention that people will always adopt those historical arguments that best suit their needs works both ways. If the followers of the prophet will simply shrug off the non-existence polemic without bothering to look into it, those who dislike or are hostile to the prophet will jump on it. For example, are you readily willing to look into and believe claims that Muhammad never existed because you are an objective seeker of truth, or is it because you dislike and are happy to embrace any argument against Muhammad? That is because you don't like him, and the notion that he never existed is very satisfying in several levels. The simple way to answer this question is by asking another. For example, if you're a Christian, have you read and tried to grapple with all the many claims against Christ's existence, which by nature should be of far greater consequence to you than claims about this Muhammad? I bet you haven't. Indeed, I bet that if you ever heard that there were arguments against Christ's existence, you dismissed them in your mind as products of bitter atheists and anti-Christians looking to undermine the Christian faith. Arguments unworthy of your attention as a Christian. You may even, as I am now arguing, have instinctively concluded that whatever such arguments, none of them can be irrefutably proven, so why bother looking into them? If you thought any of that, I'm here to tell you that I agree. But I'm also here to tell you that whatever the reason for you as a Christian not being interested in, much less rocked by, claims that Jesus never existed, are the same for Muslims when it comes to Muhammad, except times 10. Remember, whereas you may fancy yourself an objective person who is open to evaluating evidence from any, including non-Christian sources, for Muslims, non-Muslims are the de facto enemy who will never cease trying to destroy Islam. The Quran itself warns Muslims that, quote, "Never will the Jews or Christians be pleased with you until you follow their faith," end quote. That's 2:120. So when Christians and Jews come along and say, "Hey, you dumb Muslims, guess what? Your prophet never even existed," and considering all that I've already pointed out, including that such claims cannot be proven, how rocked by this assertion do you think Muslims really are? As an avid and longtime observer of Arabic and Islamic media, I can tell you that responses to the Muhammad is a myth claim veer between indifference to mockery. Muslims either ignore or laugh at it, the very same way Christians ignore or laugh at the Jesus never existed claim. Again, you may say, but if Muslims only took the time to look into the arguments for Muhammad's non-existence, surely they would come around. To which again I respond, so why haven't you, a Christian, read and seriously evaluated the arguments and claims against Christ's existence? Your rationale is theirs, and so we go in circles. By the way, my argument that in the absence of absolute proof, which is almost always the case when it comes to questions of history, people will always opt for the historical interpretation that best suits their needs, hasn't even begun to factor in the powerful faith element involved in questions about religion or religious figures, as in the current case. If secular people will adopt a historical interpretation that is most emotionally satisfying, religious people will do so on an even more extreme level. That's because for religious folk, questions about the past are further tied up with their faith. Just as Christian belief in Jesus is ultimately rooted in faith, not this or that historical record, so too is Muslim belief in Muhammad ultimately rooted in faith. So it's a double whammy. Think about it, do you really expect believers to be moved by the claims of non-believers, especially when those claims can't be proven, and those non-believers making those claims, in this case those infidels, are already seen as committed enemies of Islam who will stop at nothing to destroy it? Hence why, and with all due respect, I marvel at anyone who thinks the claim that Muhammad never existed is revolutionary and somehow going to rock the Muslim world to its core. It hasn't, and it won't, trust me. Having said all that, and to reiterate, my purpose in making this video is not to attack or even deny the claims that Muhammad never existed. Nor is this a personal attack on Dr. J. Smith, whose name I mentioned, or any of the other proponents of the Muhammad myth, far be it. I'm sure they all have good reason for saying what they say. And if you personally believe that Muhammad never existed, that's fine by me. I've already given you my reasons for believing that a Muhammad figure existed, and I'm a live and let live kind of guy. Rather, my point is that claims against Muhammad, whatever their merits, cannot by nature be proven, and are therefore at best academic and totally inconsequential to Muslims. Just as, and for the same reasons that, arguments against Jesus Christ's existence have been academic and totally inconsequential amongst Christians. Please don't underestimate the psychological element involved here. If you believe that Muhammad never existed, that's very likely because you already dislike him. Hence, any argument against him will take on a strong quality in your mind. But it's for this very same reason that the exact opposite occurs amongst Muslims. Because they love Muhammad, any argument against him, especially one that cannot be proven, will be seen as a pathetic attempt by those infidels against Islam. In this sense, Islam's nearly 2 billion Muslims are like the world's 2.5 billion Christians who, without a second thought, laugh at and dismiss claims that Christ never existed. Put differently, it's ultimately because you are against Muhammad that you are interested in and convinced by subjective arguments against him. And it's ultimately because Muslims are for Muhammad that they will never be interested in, much less convinced by the same subjective arguments. What are ultimately subjective claims against a religious figure appear very powerful only because you, the subject, are personally against that religious figure. If you're for that religious figure, they become laughable. Okay, so you're an avowed foe of Islam who would see it swept up in the dustbin of history, hence why you were so happy to jump on the Muhammad never existed bandwagon. So what now? I'll tell you what now. Whoever is interested in effectively opposing Islam must do so at its own game. That's the way it's always been and the way it's always going to be. You must embrace the Muslim paradigm and accept Islam's first premise, that the Quran, the Seerah, Hadith, etc., in a word, Islam's scriptures, do indeed contain the teachings of Muhammad and his God. But then you must show how such teachings contradict reason, logic, decency, morality, and especially godliness. Such is the original approach, the only tried and true polemic that has from the first century following Muhammad's death, via the writings of John of Damascus, arguably history's first polemicist against Islam, till the present moment been challenging and convincing Muslims that theirs is a false prophet. On the other hand, merely insisting that he never existed may be personally satisfying, but it's also a way of putting yourself out of the debate altogether, rendering yourself totally moot. So there it is, my 2 cents on Muhammad's existence. Let me know what you think in the comments. Bye.